Hey, I'm Matt Nichols at Mr. Maple, and thanks for clicking on another Mr. Maple video.
And I'm Tim Nichols at Mr. Maple. We greatly appreciate you watching these videos. Please like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and as always, sign up for our weekly emails on MrMaple.com. We add 10 new exciting trees every Tuesday. That's something you'll want to check out.
So we've been doing a series where we go over commonly asked questions. It's a little cold here, you can maybe even see my breath in the thing today. But we answer commonly asked questions here at our nursery about Japanese maples. And today's question is, where should I plant my Japanese maple?
Japanese maples, with over 1,000 varieties of Japanese maples, there's over 1,000 different uses for Japanese maples. So we're going to cover some of the most commonly used places for Japanese maples.
So the number one thing, and you've heard us say this if you've watched any of our how-to videos, is good drainage. So the number one thing for a Japanese maple is good drainage. They don't want to be in boggy or wet feet. A lot of times I'll get a question, they'll say, hey, I have an area that holds water or an area near a river where it's super soggy. What Japanese maple do you suggest? And the honest answer is, I don't suggest a Japanese maple for those spots. Japanese maples want to be in very good drainage. So you can't grow one in an area that's staying constantly damp or soggy. If it's a boggy condition, it's probably not ideal for a Japanese maple.
So with that being said, making sure that drainage is key. That's your first and foremost thing when planting a Japanese maple, where to plant a Japanese maple. Then looking at figuring out what spots do you have in your yard that you think you might want to plant a Japanese maple. Japanese maples can be used as foundational plantings. Those are those plantings near the base of your house, right around the base around your house. They can be used as background plantings. Those are the places out in the background where you've got something that's there that gives you some color or gives you some great fall color. Then there's also focal points. And Japanese maples make great specimens. So you can use those for those as well. And there's also a lot of Japanese maples that can be used to pair with other plants around your landscape in traditional garden spots.
Now you hear us talk a lot about container gardening, and that's a great way to get around some of those spots that you maybe can't plant a Japanese maple. So if you have an area that doesn't have good drainage, maybe growing a Japanese maple in a container or patio planter long term may be a good option for those spots if your heart's dead set on a Japanese maple, which I obviously think it should be because they're the coolest plants ever. So there's a lot of fun ways of growing them. We may even do a whole deep dive on some things we learned from Nakata-san about how Japanese maples grow natively there in the wild. Tim touched on it with one thing about saying Japanese maples in the background, but it just made me think a little bit about when we were in Japan and we learned about a lot of the ways Japanese maples are used as to emulate the sunset. And so all those colors are the backdrop behind a lot of the garden up front. And so they're actually bringing in that color behind some of the evergreens that were up front. And it's the rising sky, right? It's the setting sky behind that. And that's a fun way to grow them. We'll probably, if you like that, let us know in the comments below, because Tim and I were actually on a Japanese TV show, and Nakata-san actually took us into the woods and explained to us a little bit about where Japanese maples grow natively. So maybe that's a whole nother video, but it's a little bit of the same concepts as well.
Yeah, when we went to Japan and we saw them growing natively along the river, is also how they use it in traditional Japanese gardens.
Because it's emulating that what we saw in nature.
Yeah, when you see them in traditional Japanese gardens, you'll often see Japanese maples used around water features, which is a great way you can use them in the landscape as well to bring that traditional Japanese garden feel to your landscape and garden. Now, let's go through and talk a little bit about each of these spots. When you're talking about foundational planting, Japanese maples have shallow, non-invasive roots. That means that they don't have roots that are going to take over and mess up your foundation of your house like a lot of other trees will. But when we're thinking about these foundational plantings, dwarfs are going to be your best thing for those foundation spots because they're smaller. You don't want to put a large tree touching up against your house. And so by putting a dwarf like a weeping lace leaf, a Makawi Atsubusa, some dwarf varieties of Japanese maples, which you can use the filter on our website on MrMaple.com to search for mature size dwarf. Those are going to be excellent foundational plantings.
Yeah, getting back into a little bit more of the bones of the question too, where can I plant my Japanese maple? Japanese maples work zones 5 through 9. Now, you may have heard me say this in previous videos, but USDA zones are really based on how cold it gets. So zone 9 is an estimation. The coldness of that on the zone 5 makes perfect sense. The zone 9 is always an estimate. Zone 9 East Coast is a pretty good determination. Typically zone 10s on the East Coast are too hot. Zone 10 on the West Coast, the heat index may be so low that Zone 10 on the West Coast, for instance, our customer Aaron Dragseth, he's in Zone 10. He has many Japanese maples in full sun. So it's not always an exact replica there, but it is a good estimation. So if you're in Zone 4, Japanese maples may not grow there. It may not be the best situation for one. I actually have customers who protect their winters in containers and grow them in Zone 4. But Zones 5 through 9 are a good place to start for where to grow Japanese maples.
Let's talk about focal point planting. Think about the focal points you have in your yard. When you're looking at your focal points in your yard and garden, what are the places you want to show off the most? Then find the Japanese maple that you like the most.
Yeah.
If you think a smaller tree is going to work there, go with the smaller tree. If you think a larger tree is going to go there, go with the larger tree selection. And choose the tree with over 1,000 varieties that you like the most. With our selection, you can always find something really special for every focal point in the landscape. And whenever you're finding a Japanese maple for those focal points, think about it in terms of, hey, this tree has a lot of really neat variegation that's really cool when I see it up close. You're going to want to put that near the walkway. That needs to be more of a close by focal point that you can walk by and see. If you use something like that as a focal point, but something that's a little bit more distance, you won't be able to enjoy that variegation. So you want to think a lot of these things through whenever you're thinking about planting those focal points. If it's going to be something that's going to have a little more distance, maybe a tree that's just got some amazing yellow color, or something that's going to have something that really gives it a nice shocking presence, like a twisted contorted habit like Germain's gyration, that would be an excellent option for those focal points that have a little more distance. And so always keep these in mind when you're thinking about focal points, and think about it in terms of, what do I like here? How big can this tree get in this focal point? And then what are my Japanese maple options? Because there's over 1,000 options that we carry here at Mr. Maple.
Yeah, you've probably heard us say this in a lot of our cultivar videos. We often try to give suggestions for uses on where to use that particular tree. Now, a lot of your larger upright Japanese maples, so say something like a Seryu or an Emperor 1, those are excellent trees to make more foundational plantings. So they can kind of be the bones of the garden. So you can put those in to build the structure of your garden around those, because as they become the more dominant size plant in the garden, it's kind of going to be the structure that the whole garden is aligned by.
Yeah, and I think that's a great thing to look at with your Japanese maples. They're, like Matt said, they're those bones of your garden that really make your garden pop whenever you add everything together. And with that, let's talk about some of those background plantings. When you have background plantings of Japanese maples, those are those plants that are planted far out in the landscape that give you something special. And so you can think about things like this in terms of plants that have amazing fall color. Something like an Osaka Zuki that's going to be back there in the backdrop, but then when it lights up in the fall,
it's really going to draw the eyes.
It's going to draw the eye across the entire landscape. Something like a bright yellow like Michael Steinhardt of a larger trident maple back there in the background. That's going to draw your eye throughout the entire landscape through the spring and the summer, and then with that orange fall color is really going to grab you. And so a lot of these are going to be those larger plants out there in the landscape that can be used to really make your whole garden come together.
For sure. Now, Japanese maples have, if you've seen our garden, or if you've seen us ever talk about our parents' garden, we mass plant with Japanese maples. So we have a huge garden that has over 350 Japanese maples just in that garden. So there are many different ways to grow these. We typically plan our fall colors and our spring colors accordingly when we're doing a mass planting. That's another fun way to enjoy them. I think a lot of our collectors probably are doing mass plantings as well now, and that's a fun way to enjoy them. But what we try to be conscious of is that spring and fall color and those pairings. So when we're talking about pairing plants together, often those suggestions are things that are going to look good near each other in a mass planting of Japanese maples. So when you're doing that, be conscious. If you have something that has amazing yellow fall color, maybe pair that next to something that has amazing oranges or red fall colors, but an offsetting spring color. So if you can get that kind of contrast, you can really create a dynamic garden in every single season that you're in leaf. So you get some dramatic changes, and those colors really pop and play off each other.
Yeah, that was leading to my next point too, about your general gardening area. Now you can do that same thing with your background planting. You can plan that with your fall colors, your spring colors. You can do that with your focal point planting and your foundational planting. But in your general gardening area, always think about color contrast, like Matt was talking about. Color contrast is key in the landscape. Spring, summer, fall, that's when you really can use these Japanese maples to really peak something or add something special. And if you're looking for those winter interests, you can start looking at those coral barks that can give you that added winter interest in the garden.
Now we have filters on our website for which Japanese maples can handle full sun. You can look at your zone and kind of get an idea of your heat index there for which Japanese maples prefer more sun versus which ones prefer more shade. We have a whole lineup of some Japanese maples that can do great in full sun up to zone 8B. So there's some great heat tolerant ones for zone 8B. Zone 9, generally you want late day shade in all zone 9, at least as a minimal protection. And as a general rule of thumb, the more white or the more pink you have in your Japanese maple, the more late day shade you want to put on those to get those colors even better. So there's a little brief overview. Now you can definitely go into MrMaple.com and go into our filter section and check out some of our different suggestions there too, because we'll have filters that show you mature size large, mature size medium, plants that are going to make good container options, plants that are going to need more late day shade or more full sun options. So that's a great way to start to lay that out, and just be conscious of all the decisions because they're going to continue to grow. You're going to enjoy them in every season, so be conscious of that spring, summer, fall color because you can play off that and really create the most dynamic and most colorful garden. That's really what we're doing with Japanese maples. We're always adding that flash into the garden.
So far we've talked about your color contrast, your background plantings, how you can use that in so many different places. Let's take a minute and talk about textures. Let's talk about habits as well. So I'll start a little bit about textures. Whenever it comes to Japanese maples, they can really give you some unique textures in the landscape. So whenever you're planting them in the garden, think about this, because a weeping lace leaf is going to look very different texturally than something like a weeping ryusin that's going to give you a very soft, flowing feel. A lace leaf is going to give you more of that traditional Japanese feel that you see in a lot of Japanese gardens. So keep this in mind whenever you're putting things in the landscape, that the leaf structure has a lot to do with the texture as well as the branch structure. Nothing's more starkly contrast than a Makawi Atabusa or a Shishigashira out in the landscape. Shishigashira with those crumpled leaves, green, tightly knit next to the branches. It gives so much texturally to the landscape that I think that's something that needs to be thought about when you're putting them out there in the general gardening area, because it gives such a contrast and it is very pleasing to the eyes. And the Makawi Atabusa, the same thing, those tightly layering shingle habit almost gives an animal appearance out there in the landscape. So you always want to think about that because it adds something even more than just color, and these textures just give such a unique habit out there.
Yeah. Now, where you're going to plant your Japanese maple in your garden depends a lot on what size your Japanese maple is going to get. Now, you may hear us talk about it here a lot, but there's a huge range of Japanese maples for sizes, and that can vary a ton over time. You'll see a ton of different information when you go to different websites about how big a particular cultivar gets. We always try to give the most honest answer. Some people go, it's a cop-out to say in 15 years, and that doesn't make any sense. And I think it's the most honest answer you can give. I'm good friends, Peter's passed away now, but I was good friends with Peter Gregory. I went and visited him, and Peter grew up studying species. And so often Peter would approach how big something gets by the largest one he's seen of it. So if there was an Acer Gricium in the wild and it was a massive tree, that would be, how big it gets. I think with Japanese maples, they're going to outlive us all. Like we saw a 400-year-old tree in Japan, so definitely check out that video. We'll be doing a deeper dive on Nakakomoto weeping. But it really makes you conscious of a time frame with how big the tree gets. So what we try to do is give the most honest answer we can, and that is after 10 years or even after 15 years, the size expectancy of that tree. And so it's a good way to plan for your long-term sizes for that tree. Some people will say, what's the size at maturity? Well, it can continue to grow its entire life. A healthy grafted Japanese maple should live to be well over 100 years old. And so that can vary quite a bit between 40 years and 80 years. So what we're trying to do is give you the best understanding for a reasonable gardening time frame. And I think it's the most honest way to approach that question, and the best way to approach that question too, because it gives the gardener the most information for making those size determinations.
Yeah, definitely. And as Matt talked about, check out our video, Weeping Japanese Maples. That one's really got some amazing selections, and really goes in and shows some photos of that Nakakomoto weeping that we got to visit in Japan. Super special and amazing. Now, one thing we talked about, the textures, let's go into habits. When you're planting a Japanese maple out there in the landscape, always consider the habit of the Japanese maple. Not all Japanese maples are going to grow upright. Not all Japanese maples are going to be very weeping. And just because they're weeping doesn't mean that their weeping style is the same as the other weeping varieties you have. For instance, Orangeola often will cascade straight down, where Tamukiyama and Crimson Queen, or Tamukiyama especially, has an arching habit, and Crimson Queen stays much lower and is much more spreading. And so these habits are very special and unique with each Japanese maple selection. And so it's often really important to consider each selection and how it grows to see if it fits in those spots that you're looking for, because they will really show off and do something special whenever you naturally, and when you plant this in the landscape, you can accentuate that and really make your garden something spectacular.
So be conscious of the cultivar you're selecting, because you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's typically a cultivar that fits that need for that texture, that color, that shape. And if you're trying to change something like a blood good into a weeping form, you know, it's a non-winning battle there, right? It's going to be a very uphill battle for you there to get that correct. So start out with something that's going to fit your shape to begin with, and that'll help a lot. We hope you've enjoyed this quick discussion of where to plant your Japanese maple. It's a brief overview. We've covered a lot of different topics, but we hope this has been informative to you. And if it has been, please share it with somebody. That's a great way to help our channel grow, is by sharing it. And if you found it informative, definitely share it with a new gardener as well.
And we greatly appreciate you watching this video. I'm sure plenty of y'all have some awesome things y'all can add to this. So please comment that in the comment section below. I think a lot of people will be checking through there to try to learn and figure out where to plant Japanese maples in their landscape. So if you have experience with this, or have experience in planting Japanese maples, put some of your experience in the comments. We greatly appreciate that. I think a lot of people will really appreciate that as well. Please like our video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and if you want to support our channel, share this with your gardening friends, and shop on MrMaple.com.
Yeah, you can share it anywhere you share things. So if that's Facebook, Twitter, anywhere, we greatly appreciate you getting the word out about our gardening channel. And we always want more gardening channels, so we think it's a good thing if we're crazy gardeners, right? So we greatly appreciate that. And as this is no means the end of the discussion, you can continue the discussion in the comment section below. We love to hear from you. You know, we don't consider this the end-all be-all of answers, so we learn from those comments as well, and we always try to engage you with that conversation. So if anyway, this is just the beginning of the conversation, we hope you'll continue in the comment section below. We greatly appreciate you watching. God bless.
And have a great day.
Hey, I just wanted to remind everybody about our giveaway. All you have to do to be entered is like, subscribe, and share to our YouTube channel, and then post in the comment section below, "I dig Mr. Maple." And that's going to enter you to win. You can enter under every single video. So just a reminder, every single video is a chance to win. We're getting very close. We're creeping up on it pretty fast. We're going to hit 8,000 pretty soon. And when we do, we're going to select some people to win this hat. If this is a popular thing, we may be doing more. Get involved.